The new Rochester School of Music was housed in an old red brick mansion. The autumn wind blew yellow leaves across the walkways as Torrance Blackwood walked up the wide steps of the front entrance. He was greeted by the droning silence of the long corridors, punctuated by the muffled sounds of pianos and violins. The principal's reception area smelled of lavender and old wood. Torrance rubbed the strap of his backpack nervously, looking at the portraits of famous alumni on the walls. Many celebrities had started here, at this school. Perhaps in a few years, his picture would appear among those austere faces in heavy frames. The audition was set for 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Torrance arrived half an hour early, a habit instilled by his mother. Better to wait than to be late, especially when it came to the opportunity to learn from some of the best teachers in the state. The secretary, an older woman with kind eyes, offered him a cup of tea. Torrance declined. His throat needed to be taken care of. He took a bottle of water out of his backpack and took a few sips. Then he began silently repeating the chants he did every morning. At exactly 3 o'clock, the door of the principal's office opened. A crying girl came out, clutching a folder of sheet music to her chest. Torrance felt a nasty, sucking sensation under his spine. The secretary smiled encouragingly at him and nodded at the door. "Come in, they're waiting for you." In the spacious office, a woman sat at the grand piano. She didn't look up when Torrance entered. She was still writing something in her notebook. The principal, a gray-haired man in a tweed jacket, pointed Torrance to a seat at the piano. "Meredith, we're ready to begin," the principal pronounced. The woman looked up, and Torrance forgot how to breathe for a moment. Her face looked like it had stepped off the cover of a fashion magazine. Chiseled features, expressive brown eyes, a slight half-smile. She looked too young to be a teacher. "What have you prepared?" she asked, and her voice was exactly what Torrance expected, soft and deep. He named the composition, "The Sound of Silence," in his own arrangement. A bit of a risky choice for the classical school, but Torrance was confident in his abilities. The first notes of the introduction on the piano, and the whole world disappeared. Only the voice remained, his instrument, his gift. Torrance sang, feeling the music flow through him. He didn't look at the committee, but he felt Meredith's gaze on him. When the last note melted away from the ceiling, there was silence in the office. The principal coughed. "Impressive, young man. How long have you been practicing vocals?" "Since I was 7, Torrance replied, catching his breath. "Professionally?" "No, sir. I practiced privately until this year." Meredith made some sort of notation in her notebook. Her hand moved quickly and confidently. "Well," the principal adjusted his glasses, "I think we can offer you a spot in Mrs. Coleman's class. Meredith is just recruiting a new group." She looked up from her notebook and smiled again, a real smile this time, so that fine lines gathered in the corners of her eyes. "Classes 3 times a week, plus working with an accompanist. Can you handle it?" Torrance nodded. He could handle anything as long as he could hear that voice, see that smile. "Then I expect to see you on Wednesday, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Don't be late." Walking out of the school, Torrance felt drunk with happiness. He didn't even immediately notice that it had started to rain outside. Cold drops fell on his heated face, but he felt like the sun was shining inside him. Sage Frost had never thought of herself as beautiful. The mirror reflected a typical honors student. Straight brown hair, thin-rimmed glasses, pale skin with a scattering of freckles. She'd spent a lot of time in her parents' dentist's office, helping with paperwork, and that perpetual office pallor had become ingrained in her, part of her image. But Sage wasn't particularly worried about her appearance. Her world existed in books, romantic stories of all-consuming love, where the protagonists often began as gray mice and ended up as queens. She knew by heart dozens of stories where unassuming girls conquered the hearts of beautiful princes. In her room, an entire wall was occupied by bookshelves, love novels neighboring with the classics, Jane Eyre, Wuthering Heights, Gone with the Wind. Tattered tomes with bent page corners held stories of how love transformed people, made them special. Torrance came into her life in middle school. They'd been at the same desk in chemistry class, and Sage had immediately realized that he was her hero. Tall, with expressive gray eyes and a mop of dark hair, he seemed to her like the heroes of her favorite books. When he first sang at the school concert, she almost cried. So beautiful was his voice. They became fast friends. Torrance appreciated her sharp mind and her ability to explain complex things in simple words. Thanks to Sage, he hadn't failed chemistry and biology, and she enjoyed every minute she spent with him. His smile, his laughter, his occasional touches. All this she carefully put into a piggy bank of memories. In her journal, Sage kept dozens of poems dedicated to Torrance. She'd never shown them to anyone. Too personal, too candid. There were lines about his eyes, his voice, the way her heart sank when he passed by. At times, she felt like she was living in one of her novels, the part where the heroine was still dreaming of reciprocity. Sage's parents were consumed with work. Their dental clinic required a lot of time and energy. They were glad that their daughter was quiet and obedient, studying well and not causing trouble. Sometimes her mother would look into her room late at night, and when she saw her daughter with a book, she would nod approvingly. Let her read. It was better than wandering around in the middle of nowhere. They didn't realize that under the covers of novels, Sage was building her own world. A world where people like her become the protagonists, where love conquers all obstacles, where gray mice become princesses. In the school library, where Sage often hid during lunch, there was a cozy niche between the shelves. From there, she had a clear view of the schoolyard. She could spend hours watching Torrance socializing with the other kids, practicing with the band, just sitting on a bench with headphones on. Every move he made, every gesture, she compared it to the descriptions in the books. And he was invariably better than any fictional character. At home, in her room, Sage often imagined their first kiss. In her fantasies, it was during a rainstorm, like in her favorite novels, or at the school prom, where she would wear a dress and take off her glasses for the first time, or in a library, among dusty folios. She replayed these scenes over and over, adding details, polishing the dialogue. But for now, everything remained the same. They studied together, studying for tests, discussing books and music. Torrance shared his dreams of a music career with her. She was the perfect listener, attentive, understanding, always ready to support. And at night she wrote in her journal about how much it hurt to be just a friend when you dreamed of more. Every morning, Sage woke up hoping that maybe today would be different. Maybe today he would look at her differently, seeing not just a loyal friend, but a girl capable of deep feelings, a girl who knows by heart all the shades of his smile, a girl who loves him the way only books do, selflessly, forever. Torrance had become absent-minded lately, often canceling their meetings to prepare for classes. Sage wasn't offended. She understood how important music was to him. Besides, in novels, heroes also often overcame obstacles on the way to happiness, and she knew how to wait. After all, in every book there comes a moment when patience is rewarded and love triumphs. In her parents' study, where she sometimes helped with paperwork, stood an old medical cabinet. Sage knew that various medications were stored there. Painkillers, antiseptics, sedatives. Sometimes as she scrubbed the shelves, she imagined herself the heroine of a detective story or a medical novel. But more often than not, her thoughts returned to love stories and their protagonist, Torrance Blackwood. Meredith always stayed late at school. After class, the music sounded different in the empty hallways of the mansion, cleaner, more piercing. In the evenings, she liked to play the piano in her classroom, enjoying the way the sounds bounced off the high ceilings. Torrance noticed this. After the third class, he lingered, as if by accident, pretending to go over notes. Meredith didn't chase him away. She continued to play, Chopin this time, and he sat mesmerized by the movements of her hands over the keys. "You have amazing technique," he pronounced as the last chord melted into the air. 20 years of practice, she smiled without turning her head. It had become a tradition since that evening. After class, Torrance stayed in the classroom. Sometimes they just mused, she accompanied, he sang. Sometimes they talked about music, about composers, about different performance techniques. Gradually, the conversations became more personal. Meredith told how as a child she had dreamed of becoming a concert pianist, but a wrist injury had blown those plans out of proportion. Torrance shared her fears, that her voice would fail, that it wouldn't live up to expectations, that her talent would fall short. At such moments, she sat closer, and her perfume made him dizzy. Her presence worried him more and more. He caught himself scrutinizing her hands, her neck, the curve of her lips as she spoke, but she seemed oblivious to his gaze. Once, during a chant, she corrected his posture by placing her palms on his shoulders. The touch burned even through the fabric of his shirt. Torrance faltered on a note, and Meredith laughed softly. "Focus on your breathing." But it was getting harder and harder to focus, especially when she stood so close he could feel the warmth of her body, when her fingers touched his neck, showing him the correct position of his larynx, when she demonstrated breathing exercises and her breasts heaving beneath her silk blouse. "You're very talented, Torrance," she said once, as she pored over the sheet music on her desk. Her wedding ring gleamed dimly in the evening light. "But you need to learn to control your emotions. Otherwise, they'll control you." He realized she wasn't just talking about singing. He could hear the warning in her voice. "But can you control something that comes over you like a storm wave?" Their evening meetings grew longer and longer. Now they could talk for hours. Meredith talked about her travels, the concerts she'd been to, the people she worked with. Torrance listened, absorbing every word, every intonation. Sometimes she would stop halfway through and stare at him with a long, unreadable gaze. At such moments, the air between them thickened, became hot and heavy. But she was always the first to avert her eyes and change the subject. They did not speak of her husband. Torrance knew only that he was a surgeon and worked at the city hospital. He'd seen him pick Meredith up a couple times. A tall man in an expensive suit, always on the phone. "Are you happy?" Torrance asked once, not knowing himself where the boldness came from. Meredith was silent for a long time, looking out the window at the darkening sky. Then she said quietly, "Happiness is a strange thing, Torrance. Sometimes we mistake it for something else." That night was the first time she had allowed herself to linger her hand on his shoulder longer than necessary. And it was the first time he dared to cover her fingers with his. They both realized they were crossing a dangerous line. But the music and the twilight made everything unreal, blurred the boundaries of what was permissible. At such moments, it seemed that the whole world shrank to the size of this classroom, where only the two of them, the piano and the music, existed. Gradually, their repertoire changed. Now they increasingly chose romances and love songs. Meredith taught him to feel every word, to live every emotion, and he could no longer sing about love without thinking about it. "You're getting dangerously good," she remarked after a particularly good performance. Golden sparks danced in her eyes. "You're about to break quite a few hearts. And yours?" He exhaled, feeling his heart pounding. She didn't answer, just looked at him in a way that took his breath away. And then she started picking up the sheet music, signaling that the lesson was over for the day. But they both knew something had subtly changed. The air between them now tingled with tension. Every look, every gesture had taken on a new meaning. Music had become a pretext for the meetings they were looking forward to more and more. And one day, when the last rays of sunlight painted the classroom walls golden, Meredith didn't pull away when Torrance came too close. She froze, staring into his eyes, then barely audibly whispered, "We can't." But it was too late. Meredith hated the silence of their huge house. She wandered the empty rooms in the evenings, absent-mindedly touching the spines of books in the library, adjusting napkins on coffee tables, turning lights on and off. Ethan was on duty again, the third one this week. This house had once seemed like a dream come true for her. High ceilings, vintage furniture, huge windows. Now it smothered her with its perfection, like a set in a play about the perfect family life. Ethan's phone was almost always busy or out of range. "Urgent surgery, honey. Concilium, honey. Meeting with coworkers. Sorry." She'd long ago stopped expecting him for dinner. Cooked only for herself. Simple salads, light soups, a glass of wine, sometimes two. Their rare evenings together had become a silent coexistence. Ethan browsed through medical journals, answered work emails. She leafed through sheet music, preparing for class. Each in their own chair, each in their own world. "Maybe we should have a baby," he asked once, without taking his eyes off his laptop. Meredith remained silent. They both knew it wouldn't change anything. He'd be just as lost in the hospital, and she'd be even more deeply alone. Art school had been her salvation. There she felt alive, needed. The students looked at her with admiration, catching every word, especially Torrance. In his eyes she saw what had long since disappeared from her husband's eyes: delight, interest, desire. At first she'd convinced herself it was just professional pride, a talented student, a promising voice. But when his fingers accidentally touched her hands while she was working on the notes, when she caught his greedy glances, it became increasingly difficult to keep her distance. He sang as if each song was a declaration of love. His voice enveloped her, got under her skin. At such moments she forgot about everything, about the age difference, about the ring on her finger, about propriety. One morning Ethan, getting ready for work, kissed her on the cheek and said, "Has your perfume changed?" She shook her head, the same scent she'd been wearing for the past 5 years. He just hadn't been paying attention for a long time. Like the fact that she'd started wearing makeup more often, wearing more open blouses, curling her hair. All of that was for Torrance. His admiring gaze as she entered the classroom, his hitched breath when she corrected his posture during class, his timid compliments that made her heart start beating faster. At night, lying in her empty bed, she imagined how things might have been different, if she had been younger, if they had met under different circumstances, if only. But if only didn't exist. All that existed were those stolen evenings at the empty school, the stares, the casual touches, and the music. When Ethan was home, she tried to act normal. But more and more often, she caught herself comparing his confident surgeon's movements and Torrance's awkward grace, his condescending smile and her student's open, boyish laugh. The phone glowed with new messages. "I can't stop thinking about you. You're especially beautiful today. I need to see you." She deleted them immediately, but the words stayed in her mind, warming her soul. She knew she was playing with fire, that it wouldn't end well, that she had to stop before it was too late. But every time Torrance appeared on the doorstep of her classroom, all good intentions crumbled to dust. He made her feel wanted, alive, real. Not just the wife of a successful surgeon, not just a music teacher, a woman who was idolized, dreamed of, for whom they were willing to do crazy things. Ethan hadn't noticed the change in her. Perhaps he didn't want to notice. His world revolved around the operating room and the patients, and she was learning to live a double life. A model wife at home, and a woman drowning in forbidden passion within the walls of the school. Every night she promised herself that this was the last time, that tomorrow she would stop these meetings, return to a proper life. But tomorrow came, and everything started all over again. The looks, the touches, the music, and the heavy, hot air between them. And somewhere in the back of her mind, she knew the denouement was inevitable. The only question was what price she would have to pay for those stolen moments of happiness. Torrance had become different lately. Sage noticed every little thing. She'd studied him too long to miss the change. He smiled less at recess, looked at his phone more often, constantly checking messages. His gaze wandered somewhere far away, as if in another reality. At first, she'd put it down to music school. Extra lessons required a lot of time and energy. But when he canceled their traditional chemistry class for the 3rd time, Sage began to worry. "Sorry, lots of work with vocals," he threw in, hurriedly packing his backpack after class. He had always walked her home before. Now he was practically running towards the music school. That day she'd decided to follow him. It was silly and childish, just like the novels she'd read, but anxiety gnawed at her from the inside, forcing her to break her own rules. The old art school building towered over the quiet street like a fairy tale castle. Sage had never been inside, but she'd often imagined those hallways when Torrance talked about classes. She lurked behind the trees in the small square across the street, feeling ridiculous and out of place. Time stretched slowly. Muffled sounds of music came through the high windows of the 2nd floor. Sage imagined Torrance singing, his voice filling the space. It was getting dark. One by one, the lights in the windows went out, and then she saw them. They came out of the side entrance. Torrance and a woman Sage recognized immediately from his stories. Mrs. Coleman, Meredith, his vocal teacher. She was exactly as he'd described her, only better. Tall, slender, with the perfect posture and grace of a dancer. Her brown hair fell in soft waves over her shoulders. Even in the twilight, it was obvious how flawlessly her silk blouse fit her, how elegantly her pencil skirt fit her figure. They stood too close together, too intimate for teacher and student. Sage saw Torrance say something, looking at Meredith with an expression she'd never noticed on his face. Adoration, admiration, desire. Tall, fully grown, he leaned slightly toward his teacher as if trying to catch every word she said, every breath she took. And then Meredith smiled, that special smile that made Sage's heart ache. She knew smiles like that from her books, the way women smiled when they were sure of their power over men. All the way home, Sage was shaking. Her mind was reeling with scraps of romantic stories where beautiful and cruel women broke the hearts of young heroes. Meredith seemed to be the embodiment of all the evil queens from fairy tales. Flawless, unattainable, dangerous. At home, Sage pulled out her journal. With trembling fingers, she leafed through the pages, written in confessions to Torrance. How naive and childish they looked now. How could she compete with such a woman? At night, she had a nightmare. She was back at the art school, running down the endless corridors to the sound of music. But when she opened the classroom door, she froze in horror. Meredith, beautiful and frightening, like an evil queen from fairy tales, was playing the piano. And the piano was alive. It was breathing and moaning with Torrance's voice. "See," laughed Meredith, turning to Sage. "It is now forever my instrument. I'm the only one who can get music out of him." Her fingers ran across the keys, and the piano wailed again with Torrance's voice. "No!" screamed Sage, trying to rush to the piano, but Meredith snapped her fingers, and the classroom began to fill with notes. Black, sharp, like a flock of birds of prey. She woke up in tears, with her heart pounding frantically. In the morning, she stood for a long time in front of the mirror, examining herself with merciless clarity. The disheveled hair, which she usually gathered into a careless ponytail, the glasses that hid her sleep-deprived eyes, the school uniform that sat baggy on her skinny figure. At school, she'd walked past the chemistry room where she usually studied with Torrance. He was sitting there, staring at his phone, a dreamy smile playing on his lips. Before, he'd always looked up when she walked by, as if he sensed her presence. Now he didn't notice. In class, she couldn't concentrate. Her mind was reeling with scenes from love novels, stories of forbidden passion between teachers and students. But now she saw them from a different perspective. Not romantic stories about overcoming obstacles, but chronicles of broken hearts. At lunchtime, she hid in the library again. She pulled out the Twilight Saga, a love story of an ordinary girl and a beautiful, unattainable creature. She used to imagine herself as Bella and Torrance as Edward, dreaming of the same all-consuming love. Now every page resonated with pain. Wasn't that how Torrance looked at Meredith, as if she were some higher being? And she herself, Sage, was just one of the extras, a gray shadow against this perfect woman. In the evening, helping her parents at the clinic, Sage absent-mindedly scrubbed the shelves of the medicine cabinet. Among the neatly arranged medications, her eye caught a vial of arsenic. They used it in minimal doses for some dental procedures. She remembered stories of famous poisoners of the past, women who used poison to solve their love problems. In novels, such heroines were always beautiful and dangerous, just like Meredith Coleman. That night, Sage was writing in her journal again. But now it wasn't declarations of love. She was describing Meredith. Every detail of her appearance, every gesture, every look. It was as if she were creating a portrait of the villain for her own story. "She's like a queen from a fairy tale," Sage wrote, "beautiful and ruthless. She'll break his heart and then go back to her perfect life, and he'll never know how much I love him." The pages of the diary were wet with tears, the ink blurred. Somewhere in the house, a clock struck midnight. Sage sat in the dark, clutching the notebook to her chest, and for the first time in her life she realized that sometimes love could be dark and desperate. Not light and lofty, as in novels, but dark and desperate, capable of pushing her to madness. Outside the window, the night rain rumbled. On such nights, plot twists in novels usually happen. Decisions are made that change destinies. Sage stared into the darkness and felt something inside her break, giving way to something new and frightening. The days stretched on endlessly. Sage skipped lunch more and more often, spending hours in the library. She reread her favorite moments from Twilight and other novels about tragic love, but now she saw new facets to them. Bella and Edward's story didn't seem so romantic anymore. What if Edward had fallen in love not with Bella, but with some beautiful vampire? How would the simple, unremarkable girl feel then? She tried to stay away from Torrance in the school hallway, but she still noticed every detail. A new shirt, obviously chosen with care, expensive headphones, a fashionable haircut. It was like he was glowing from the inside out, radiating a happiness that made Sage's heart clench. Torrance's cell phone was always face down now. Once, when they were sitting next to each other in chemistry, a message came through, and Sage caught the sender's name. M. Just one letter, but it was like a punch in the butt. Torrance immediately grabbed the phone, that same smile on his face. Gentle, dreamy, meant just for her, for Meredith. After school, she walked to the music school again. Now it had become a compulsive habit, hiding behind the trees, watching the windows of the classroom where Torrance was studying. Sometimes she could see their silhouettes, Torrance's tall figure and Meredith's graceful, chiseled figure. They stood close, too close. The windows glowed late into the night. At home, Sage leafed through her old diary, rereading the entries from the first time she'd met Torrance. He had seemed like Edward to her then, just as handsome, just as unattainable, just as special. She'd written pages of love declarations. Now those words seemed childish, ridiculous. Real love was different, dark, painful, searing. In her parents' medicine cabinet, she found special literature. The articles on the effects of various drugs read like a thrilling novel. She was especially interested in the section on poisons. Arsenic was called the king of poisons, and inheritance powder. In past centuries, it had been used by lovers to stay together forever. It seemed so romantic, the two of them leaving together, disappearing into eternity. At night, she was plagued by visions. Meredith at the piano, turning Torrance into an obedient instrument, his voice merging with the music, dissolving into it. Sage would wake up in tears, choking with impotent rage and despair. In chemistry class, they were going over arsenic compounds. Sage was writing down the formulas especially carefully, absorbing every word the teacher said. Torrance sat beside her, absent-mindedly scribbling in the margins of his notebook. She noticed he was scribbling tiny notes. That evening, while helping her parents at the clinic, she lingered deliberately at the medicine cabinet. The little vial seemed to call to her, promising a solution to all her problems. Romantic stories always ended in the death of lovers, like Romeo and Juliet, like the heroes of Twilight, ready to die for each other. In her journal, Sage began a new entry. She envisioned her and Torrance walking out of this world together, leaving behind everyone beautiful Meredith, her busy husband, and her indifferent parents. Just him and her, together forever, just like in their favorite books. It wasn't just a fantasy, it was a plan. They had special water coolers in the chemistry room. Torrance always drank only from them. He took care of his voice and watched his drinking regimen. It would be so easy to wait for the right moment when he came to study after class. Sage imagined his last look, not clouded by his love for Meredith, but turned only to her. Maybe in his last moments he would realize how much she loved him, how willing she was to do anything to keep him away from that woman. At night, she continued to write in her journal, planning every detail. The pages were covered with feverish notes, diagrams, quotes from her favorite books. "Death is only the beginning," she wrote on the last page. "We will be together forever." In her inflamed imagination, their deaths were supposed to be beautiful, like a scene from a novel. No pain, no blood, just a dream from which the two of them would walk away, leaving behind this cruel world where beautiful women like Meredith stole other people's happiness. Torrance barely noticed her now. His whole world had narrowed down to the music school, to the classroom where she was waiting for him. Flawless, unattainable Meredith. But soon, very soon, everything would change. They would be together, the way they should have been from the beginning. Sage smiled, stroking the small vial in her pocket with her fingers. Her love was stronger than life, stronger than death, stronger than the charms of the beautiful queen who had stolen her prince. Meredith had broken the cardinal rule of not answering messages after 10 o'clock at night. But when Torrance's name appeared on the screen, she couldn't help herself. Ethan was on duty at the hospital, and the house was empty and quiet again. "Can't stop thinking about today," Torrance wrote. Today was the first time they'd kissed. It happened after class. Stupid, spontaneous, inevitable. She was correcting his posture, and suddenly his lips were very close. They stared at each other for a moment, and then reality shattered. Meredith knew she should have pushed him away, but his kiss was so greedy, so sincere. She forgot about everything. The age difference, the ring on her finger, the fact that someone might come in. Only his hands, his lips, his hitched breath existed. "I'm going crazy," she admitted in a return message. There was nothing of the vulgarity of a resort romance or an affair with a student in their story. Torrance idolized her, not as an accomplished woman, but as an equal. When he sang, his voice bared his soul, and Meredith saw in him a mirror image of her own passion for music. The next day, they tried to behave as usual, but during class, their fingers touched more often than necessary, their gazes lingering longer than they should. Torrance sang about love, and every word hit the mark. In the evening, already in the car, he suddenly asked, "Do you regret it?" Meredith shook her head. To regret was to admit a mistake, and she couldn't consider it a mistake that made her feel alive again. They'd agreed to meet on Saturday, the first time they'd ever met outside of school. Meredith knew it was crazy. But when Torrance looked at her with those gray eyes, when his voice trailed off with excitement, all reason lost its power. "I love you," he wrote late that night. She did not reply. Some words are better left unspoken, especially when you know they're true. In bed, looking at her husband sleeping beside her, Meredith thought about how strange life was. 15 years of marriage, a shared home, shared friends, and such a bottomless void between them, and a 17-year-old boy made her heart beat as if for the first time. In the morning, Ethan left early, as usual. He kissed her on the cheek, told her he'd be staying late at the hospital. She nodded, not lifting her eyes from her coffee cup. Before, his absence had hurt. Now she was counting the hours until she saw Torrance again. They saw each other every day at school. His talent was blossoming. His voice was getting stronger, his technique more perfect. The other teachers noticed his progress, praising his success. No one guessed that between rehearsals and singing they kissed until they were dizzy, that his hands slid down her body, that she moaned his name. Torrance wrote her poems, inept, naive, and all the more poignant because of it. She kept them in a secret folder on her phone, rereading them on late nights when the longing became unbearable. They both realized that their story couldn't end well, that one day everything would fall apart: reputation, career, family. But music and passion had become so intertwined that it was impossible to separate the two. That night, as she fell asleep, Meredith thought she felt real for the first time in years. She hadn't realized that feeling would come at such a terrible cost. "Can you help with chemistry?" asked Sage in the morning, looking somewhere past Torrance. He nodded absent-mindedly. He only had 2 hours before his meeting with Meredith, but it was really worth studying. The house greeted them with coolness and silence. Sage's parents were at the clinic, as usual. There were 2 glasses of water and an open chemistry textbook on the kitchen table. "I made tea," Sage said, though Torrance didn't remember her turning on the kettle. He sat down at his desk, pulled out his notebook. A new song was spinning in his head. He was preparing it for Meredith. Lately, the music had been flowing. He was awash in melodies and images. Sage was saying something about chemical reactions. Her voice came from far away. Torrance took a sip of water, his mouth dry. He imagined how in 2 hours he would see Meredith, how she would smile at him with her special smile. The first bout of nausea came on suddenly. Torrance bent over, gulping for air. Black spots swam before his eyes. What's going on?" Sage was silent. She sat motionless, looking at him with wide-open eyes. There was no fear in them, just some strange, detached expression. Pain twisted his insides. Torrance tried to get up, but his legs gave out. He collapsed to the floor, catching the glass. Water spilled across the table, dripping onto an open notebook. "Sage, help." She knelt down beside him. "It's okay," she whispered. "We're going to be together, forever." The last thing Torrance saw was her face, calm, almost happy, and then the world went out. The sound of a door opening, a scream, someone's hands, the siren of an ambulance. Overdose, arsenic, lavage, stat. Sage sat on the kitchen floor, watching Torrance being wheeled away. She felt strangely calm. There was an empty vial in her pocket. A familiar ache spilled through her chest. The poison was beginning to take effect. "Daughter, what have you done?" her mother sobbed. But Sage didn't hear. She was smiling. Soon, very soon, she would meet Torrance, where there are no beautiful music teachers, where there's just the two of them and eternity ahead. "Hurry up! Another case of poisoning!" The world went dark. Her last thought was, it was a pity she didn't have time to finish their story in her diary. But maybe someone else would tell it, the story of a love that was stronger than life. Torrance died on the way to the hospital. Sage was saved. Her body was stronger than she'd bargained for. The poison didn't take her to follow her lover. Reality was far more ruthless than the novels she'd read. Detective Raven Hope didn't like teenage cases. In her 20 years on the job, she'd learned there was nothing scarier than youth facing death. This time, it was especially hard. A 17-year-old boy, a promising musician, poisoned by a classmate. She started with Sage's parents. The dental clinic greeted her with sterile cleanliness and the smell of antiseptic. Sage's mother, a gaunt woman with reddened eyes, mechanically repeated the same thing. "We didn't notice anything. She was so quiet, reading all the time. How could we have known?" Her father was tougher. The arsenic was kept in a safe, for medical purposes only. The key was always in the desk drawer. Raven wrote down the statement, noting details. The drawer wasn't locked. Sage helped with the paperwork, had easy access to the office. It was painfully simple. Meredith Coleman was next. The music teacher was impeccable, not a crack in the perfect facade. But Detective Hope had long ago learned to see what was behind the masks. Torrance was very talented. Meredith's voice trembled slightly at his name. "One of our most promising students. Did you spend much time with him?" "Only lessons, 3 times a week." Raven noted the way Meredith's fingers rubbed her wedding ring. How she avoided a direct look. How often she mentioned her class schedule as if building an alibi that no one would accuse her of. Ethan Coleman gave the impression of a man living in a parallel reality. His office at the hospital smelled of coffee and antiseptic. He talked about work, about surgeries, about important conferences. He mentioned his wife in passing. "Meredith is very anxious. She gets attached to the students. Have you noticed anything unusual in your wife's behavior lately?" "I'm sorry, detective, but I work 16 hours a day, saving lives. I don't have time to monitor my wife's moods." Raven looked through Torrance's cell phone. Dozens of messages signed simply M. Short, careful phrases that guessed much more behind them. "Looking forward to seeing you. Thinking of you. Be careful." In Sage's diary, the story unfolded like a romance, passionate, painful, with an inevitable tragic denouement. The last entries were almost incoherent. Drawings of pianos, music stands, crowns. The words, "Together forever," repeated over and over. At the hospital, Sage was silent, staring out the window with a paused gaze, rubbing the edge of the hospital sheet. Only once did she suddenly say, "Have you read Twilight?" It was a love story there too, but they managed to be together. Raven was putting the mosaic together piece by piece. A talented boy, a beautiful music teacher, a lonely girl living a fantasy, an old story that turned tragic. Meredith's phone was the last thing she checked. All the messages to Torrance had been deleted, but the notes still contained poems, inept, poignant, full of youthful passion. And one photograph, Torrance at the piano, head tilted back, eyes closed. The picture was taken in the evening light, obviously after class. The case was very clear. The murder weapon had been found. Killer confessed. The motive was obvious. Teenage obsession multiplied by romantic fantasy. But something was bugging Raven. She kept going back to Meredith's testimony, to her perfect mask that hid fear. The way she'd talked about Torrance, as if she were trying to convince herself that he was just a student. In her report, Detective Hope had written what was required. Facts, evidence, a confession, a story about an obsessed girl who decided death was better than unhappy love. The second story, about a woman who let herself forget age and morality, about a boy whose first love proved fatal. She kept to herself. Some secrets are best not disturbed, especially when they'd already led to tragedy. Sage spoke for the first time a week after Torrance's death. Detective Hope sat in the hospital room, watching the girl go through the pages of her journal that her parents had brought. "You know, things always end differently in books," Sage pronounced without looking up. "When lovers die together, it's beautiful, like Romeo and Juliet, like Bella and Edward might, but in reality, it turned out to be so ugly." She spoke quietly, monotonously, as if she were reading a boring report. She told how she'd been watching them, Torrance and Meredith, how she'd seen their glances, their casual touches, how she hated this woman beautiful, unattainable, like an evil queen from a fairy tale. She turned him into her instrument. He sang only for her, looked only at her. I became invisible, even more invisible than before. There was no anger or jealousy in Sage's voice, just weariness and some childish bewilderment. She told how she had studied the effects of arsenic, how she had stolen the key to the safe, how she had planned their mutual death. "I thought it would be romantic, that we'd just fall asleep holding hands, and then meet up where there's no Meredith or other beautiful women, just the two of us." She fell silent, smoothing the pages of the journal with her fingers. The last entry broke off halfway through. "And now he's dead. Really dead. And I'm here. Alone." Detective Hope looked at the frail girl in her hospital pajamas and thought about how easily teenage fantasies turn into nightmares, how dangerous first love multiplied by loneliness and romantic illusions can be. "Meredith is alone too," Sage said suddenly. "I saw her at the funeral. She stood far away from everyone, but I knew she wasn't crying like a teacher for a student. It's funny, isn't it? We both loved him, and we both lost him." There was no triumph or gloating in her words, just a strange, almost adult understanding. Later, filling out the final paperwork for the case, Raven Hope thought that there were no villains or heroes in this story, just people, a beautiful woman longing for the golden cage of marriage, a talented boy whose first love turned out to be his last, and a lonely girl who decided death was the way out. A month later, Meredith Coleman quit her job at the art school. Her husband received a job offer in another city. They left quietly without saying goodbye. Sage was transferred to a closed clinic. Her diary remains in the case file, dozens of pages written in small handwriting, full of love, jealousy, and despair. A story that could have been just another teenage novel, but turned into a tragedy. On the last day of the investigation, Detective Hope found a draft of an unsent message on Torrance's phone. "Meredith, I know this whole thing is crazy, but I've never been happier." She deleted the message. Some secrets are better left unsolved, some stories untold, and in Sage's room, there was still an open copy of Twilight, a love story where death was the beginning, not the end. Maybe that was the main mistake, wanting to turn reality into a fairy tale where all lovers live happily ever after, or die beautifully. But life is not a book, and death is never beautiful.